I'm really delighted to be here. Also, you heard just a minute ago that I served as Minister of Health of my country, Mexico, for 6 years. So during that period of time, I got used to speaking while people eat. So please feel free to continue to enjoy your lunch. And I know we are trying to compress the program so that we can all be out of here and get you out before the hurricane arrives. So I'm going to summarize. I did write a fairly detailed presentation, and the organizers will have a copy of that for anyone who wants to have a little bit more background. But I'm just going to give the highlights and leave a little bit of time for a Q&A. But first of all, let me start just by thanking the Sylvester Comprehensive Cancer Center, the Miami Institute for the Americas, the Miller School of Medicine here at the University of Miami, the Unión Latinoamericana contra el Cáncer de la Mujer, the Women and Health Initiative at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, and Tómatelo a Pecho for organizing this symposium and for inviting me to speak today. What I wanted to discuss very briefly is really two topics. The first one is the absolute need we have to integrate better the strategies, because we're living at a very complex time in the way the global health agenda is being shaped, and I think we need a much more integrative approach. And I think the topic of cancers that almost exclusively affect women, exclusively in the case of cervical and almost or overwhelmingly in a majority of like breast cancer, those two cancers actually offer almost an illustration of what could be, our standard dichotomous thinking of what cancer that's mostly of infectious origin. It's an infectious disease. It's associated with poverty, versus breast cancer, which is a non-communicable disease, and that we could actually reproduce some of those dichotomies. Instead, I think there is a chance to integrate them, and I will illustrate how we did that a little bit in a comprehensive strategy in Mexico, a comprehensive health system reform strategy. And then I would just like to end briefly on the second part with a couple of comments on the role of universities in this effort at integration. But let me just start to begin with a little bit of the context. During the last century, the 20th century, particularly the latter part, as humankind was experiencing the largest gains in health in human history, remember we doubled life expectancy during the course of the 20th century, and particularly after World War II, we experienced the most rapid gains in life expectancy. As we did that, and the epidemiologic picture became much more complicated, we also evolved a way of thinking in global health that's highly divisive and dichotomous. Manichaean is the word one can use. It was probably a reflection of an era where we got accustomed to a bipolar world, and we were trying to constantly force dichotomies that were mutually exclusive. But in the health field, this led to a list that's actually quite impressive once you put it all together. Prevention of false dichotomy, prevention versus treatment. Primary care versus specialized care. My favorite, vertical versus horizontal programs. Infectious diseases versus non-communicable diseases. Social determinants versus medical care. Knowledge versus action, et cetera, et cetera. It was an era where we had that. And I think what that did was polarize the global health community in camps. And that was particularly acute because the world was going through the most tense and intense epidemiologic transition in the history of humankind. For most of humankind, most diseases happen in young children. They were the result of a succession of acute episodes, mostly of external origin, either injury and most commonly microbial infections. We don't have time to talk about the causes for that, but the fact of the matter is that in the course of a very compressed period of time, that picture changed dramatically, and most diseases started moving later. That started moving later in life. As the transition began, it started with a selective, sharp decline of infectious diseases, deaths related to infectious diseases among young children. And as a result of that, you had a very complicated situation because we began, like we're always in health, to be victims of our own success. People who would have otherwise died at a young age lived long enough to develop mostly non-communicable diseases. And the experience of disease, instead of being a succession of acute episodes from which either you recover, from which you either die or recover and then you recover to face the next acute episode, the experience of disease began moving towards a chronic condition of living, a condition that's very often associated with your identity. We talk about living with HIV/AIDS, we talk about living with cancer. People say, I am diabetic. It is part of your identity. An identity that's very often stigmatized, subject to stigma. And that is one of the most profound transformations of the century. But that, which was generally movement in the right direction, movement towards progress, because we were basically stopping a lot of young children from dying at an early age and not even having the opportunity of developing a non-communicable disease. That, however, that progress happened at a very unequal pace, and it did not happen in a linear fashion. And so what you had was a model of the epidemiologic transition that I have called in some very early writings the protracted polarized model, a transition that was protracted because it was so unequal that it didn't get resolved, and it polarized populations within countries and across countries. Women's cancers actually reflect this protracted polarized transition because you have the coexistence of what's typically a pre-transitional cancer, which is cervical cancer, an infectious disease, with a post-transitional ailment, such as breast cancer. And of course, those patterns were very different in developed and developing regions of the world. In developed regions, the epidemiologic transition was mostly characterized by a process of substitution of problems. New problems substituted old problems. In developing countries, you had a juxtaposition of problems. You hadn't really solved the old problems when you were already facing the new ones. So what you have today is that practically every single death in the world from cervical cancer happens in developing countries. There are still some cases in developed countries, but almost no deaths. But without having solved that challenge, those countries, low and middle income countries, are already facing the challenge of non-communicable disease, in our case of breast cancer. And you have this much more messy picture about priorities. And especially in the 70s, it seemed like the world was a simple place. If you were in a rich country, your priority were non-communicable disease, in this case breast cancer. If you were in a poor country, your priorities were communicable disease, in our case cervical cancer. That was an illusion. It was never that simple. The picture was always much more complicated. And in developing countries, you have no choice but to deal with both sets of priorities. This is what's being called the double burden of disease, to which, by the way, we now talk of a triple burden of disease, because in addition to communicable and non-communicable, we now face all of these problems directly linked to globalization. For example, the health consequences of climate change, among others, extreme weather events like the one we are about to suffer here, or rising sea levels, which in Miami is also almost an existential threat, and in many other parts of the world. So you now have that triple burden of disease, making the situation very much more complex than we have had in the past. And yet our response was, first of all, at the national level, health systems did not cope with this transition. And health systems that were designed to deal with acute succession of episodes were poorly suited to a situation where the experience of disease is mostly as a chronic condition of living. So health systems were not adjusted to the problem of chronicity in the delivery model. More importantly, this complex picture implied the emergence of problems that were much more complex and costly to prevent and to treat. And most countries of the world, it's hard to believe that when you're speaking in the United States, actually have health systems that are severely underfunded to cope with this complex picture. And what had happened around the world, was that a lot of those costs of treating diseases were transferred to families, and suddenly you had the problem of catastrophic health expenditures facing a large number of families. The WHO estimates that about 100,000 families every year become impoverished because of an episode of illness, typically chronic diseases, whether it's acute like AIDS, or chronic disease, whether it's infectious like AIDS or non-infectious like breast cancer. But that 100 million families are ruined every year because they have to face the economic consequences of facing an illness like this one. So what do we need to do then? It's clear to me that the big challenge we have is to completely transform health systems, both challenges, whether it's cervical cancer as an exemplar of an infectious disease, typically a disease of poverty, and breast cancer, a disease that illustrates a very important concept. And that concept is that problems only of the poor are not the only problems of the poor. Problems that only affect poor people, like cervical cancers, are not the only problems that affect poor people. Poor people also suffer higher rates of non-communicable diseases. And in the case of breast cancer in particular, what we're seeing is that although the rates, if anything, are the incidence rates are not that different, dying from breast cancer is increasingly becoming something that preponderantly happens to poor women, whether they are in rich countries or in poor countries, but to poor women. And so the case fatality of breast cancer cases is much higher for poor people. So you have that key notion that problems only of poor people, like cervical cancer, are not the only problems. Poor people also either suffer higher incidence of a lot of non-communicable diseases, or even if the incidence is not higher, the case fatality is much higher because they don't have access to effective treatment or they cannot afford that treatment. So we need to strengthen health systems. And what I want to briefly tell you is how we dealt with that. And we dealt with that in Mexico, particularly a reform that started a little bit over 10 years ago, in which, Mexico, like many countries, typically middle-income country, had millions of people who were uninsured. By the way, there's also one very rich country that was like that, and it's the United States. In Mexico, like in the United States, access to insurance was a benefit of employment instead of a right of citizenship. And what we did, and what the Affordable Care Act has done in the United States, is to sever the link between having a job and having insurance. Health insurance should be a right, an entitlement of people irrespective of their position in the labor market. And that's what a lot of those reforms have achieved. In the case of Mexico, we did exactly that. We created about half of the Mexican population, about 50 million people then, had insurance because they had a salary job. It was a benefit of their job. And the other half, which were self-employed people and their families, were uninsured. And those were the ones who were suffering huge catastrophic expenditures. And thanks to the work of a lot of people, including very prominently our own Felicia Knoll, who led and worked with a lot of health economists, and calculated that about 3 to 4 million families in Mexico were every year experiencing catastrophic or impoverishing health expenditures. So a lot has been written about that reform because it was designed and implemented by academics like me, so we like to evaluate things and write. So there's a huge literature of probably a couple of hundred papers in peer-reviewed journals and about 24 doctoral dissertations on the Mexican reform. So anyone who's interested can read about that. But let me tell you that the core idea was to introduce a new insurance scheme for the non-salary population called Seguro Popular, and that now, after all these years, covers about 54 million people. So basically, it covers everyone. There's still a lot of challenges, mostly with combining coverage with quality, but basically, catastrophic expenditures have gone down in a pretty dramatic way. And what we did was an effort at integration. And the integration was both taking the entire cycle of care, getting away from this dichotomy between prevention versus treatment, primary care versus specialized care, acting on social determinants versus providing access to high quality health care, and we tried to integrate. the insurance scheme created 3 funds: a fund for community health services that mostly focuses on prevention, including access to the human papilloma virus vaccine. It included also access and funded much better access to early detection, like mammograms or pap smears. But it also, there was one fund, there was a second fund for access to essential health services, which was mostly everything that's covered in primary and secondary levels. And then it had a third fund for catastrophic health expenditures, which basically funded on a per-case basis, and not a fee-for-service, but a per-case basis, funded the treatment of cases. And we have here Dr. Alejandro Moar, who was at that time the director of the National Cancer Institute, and that was one of the leading tertiary centers where the insurance scheme started transferring money to treat cases. Let me just give you one statistic about breast cancer, because I don't want to, I'm going to end very soon. Before this reform, about 30% of women who were diagnosed with breast cancer had to abandon treatment because they or their families ran out of money. That was the only cause. And of course, those women had the worst of both worlds. Because treatment that gets interrupted is ineffective, they anyway ended dying, but on top of that, their families were bankrupt, and those financial shocks typically go several generations. That proportion went down from 30 to about 1% of women who start treatment and have to abandon it for financial costs. But the number of women now accessing is much larger, because there was a lot of women that didn't even start treatment because they couldn't afford it. So that's the kind of situation that happens. So that financial protection was provided in this comprehensive way, trying to encompass the entire, what's been called the entire cycle of care, from prevention, early detection, treatment, palliation, the entire cycle of care. The other thing that we tried to integrate was to bring together this one of the most deepest divides in global health, which has been between vertical and horizontal approaches. Vertical approaches have the advantage that they focus on particular health challenges, and cervical cancer has been a typical vertical program in most countries. But they have the problem that they fail to create synergies, and basically they don't prepare for success. They don't deal with the consequences of success. If you deal effectively with the problem, and women stop dying from cervical cancer, they will live long enough to develop. But vertical problems end by approaching that, and that's it. The alternative have been horizontal programs that seek to strengthen health systems broadly. But that is also not satisfactory, because if you do that and you don't have a clear sense of priorities, invariably health systems end up catering to the needs of the better off. That's just the nature of social forces. Instead of that, what we need is an integrative approach that my friend and colleague Jaime Sepúlveda has called the diagonal approach. I mean, literally extending the geometric metaphor and using clear priorities to drive improvements into general improvements into the health system, so that the health system, even if it deals with the initial set of priorities, is better prepared to deal with the next set of priorities will come as a result of the success in tackling the original priorities. In our case, this was expressed, and particularly relevant, in a comprehensive program that was called Women and Health. And here also is Anna Langer, who was very much involved and subsequently has had a big role in disseminating this at a global scale and chairing and authoring a recent Lancet report on women and health. And I don't have time, and hopefully she'll tell you more about that, but that was a comprehensive approach that tried to deal in a comprehensive way with women's health issues, including cancers, while at the same time focusing on the growing role of women, and not just as the bearers of the problems, but as the drivers of the solutions. The role of women, both as community leaders, as decision makers in the household, as community health workers, and increasingly as the majority of the health workforce, the professional health workforce, certainly through nursing, but also increasingly in other health professions like medicine. So it's a very interesting approach, And we in Mexico were able to develop a comprehensive strategy around women and health that started with a core priority of reducing maternal mortality, probably the single most blatant example of the unfinished agenda, but increasingly looked to integrate across other reproductive health problems, then other problems of women, including cervical and breast cancer, and then the role of women not just as the bearers of problems, but as the drivers of solutions. And it was a very, very interesting idea, and Anna now leads an initiative on women and health at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Let me finish with one last word on what I think universities can bring to this and why we are here. I mean, in addition to convening, I think universities have a key role to play. I've been now for a year here at the University of Miami, and I've articulated the aspirations as the university looks forward to its first century. The university was founded in 1925, so in 2025, 9 years from now, we will be 100 years old. And for our second century, I talk about 4 big aspirations: to be the hemispheric university, the excellent university, the relevant university, and the exemplary university. And what that means, hemispheric, is what's obvious. We are here at the crossroads of the Americas, and this symposium is an example. And we want very much the university to partner with growing a consortium of universities and other organizations throughout the entire hemisphere, from Canada to the southern tip of South America. The excellent university means the pursuit of excellence and the advancement of knowledge, which has been the most powerful instrument to produce enlightened social transformation. And so that's what we are, that's what's our business. And I link it to being relevant, being connected to the main problems affecting a society. And lastly, universities, the idea of the exemplary university is that universities should offer, in the values they embrace and the behaviors they follow, they should be a model or example for the societies of which they are a part. And those are values like inclusion, like diversity, like the capacity to sort out our differences in a civil and respectful manner, like advancing the primacy of reason in tackling problems rather than ideological confrontation. And that, with that I want to close, because I think the topic that brings us today here is a topic that speaks to a number of values in our society. As you know, I had the unique experience of accompanying Felicia in her journey, in her cancer treatment. That allowed me a level of insight into the health system that I had never had either in my whole life as an expert or my 6 years as Minister of Health. And I like to say that I went from leading to living a health system, and it's very different, believe me. When you're on the other side of the table, you get a unique perspective that you don't get when you're either learning about health systems or leading health systems. Living health systems as a patient or as the partner of a patient is a very different experience. And through that, in addition to accompanying my wife, I started reflecting, because there was a large number of women that we, as Felicia was undergoing her treatment, that we spoke with. And what struck us was the experience of talking with women who very explicitly said, I will not have a mammogram because I don't want to be diagnosed with breast cancer, because if I have breast cancer, my husband typically, or my partner, will abandon me. And what that made me realize is that the fight against women's cancers, breast and cervical cancer, is, of course, it's a public health and a medical crusade, but it is most importantly a fight for the dignity of women. The other big cancer we have in our societies, which is the cancer of stigma, discrimination, machismo, and the absolute pervasive attempt to reduce women to parts of their body. So this is a fight for the dignity of women, and as I think about how we can be exemplary institutions, I think to the extent we embrace certainly the scientific aspects, but we also emphasize that we are in this together for a larger cause, I think we will set that example for our societies. Thank you very much for inviting me. Do we have a few minutes for questions, or you need to move on given I'm not the boss. Any questions or comments? I guess we have like about 10 minutes for that.
Hi, my name is Catherine Huynh, and I'm an undergraduate researcher at Miller in Cancer Bio, and I'm the current work study of the Women and Gender Studies program here at UM. And I was wondering what measures you intend to take to help improve women's health on campus.
Women's health on campus.
Yeah, on campus.
It's a great question because well, as you know, the university has itself a large academic health system called UHealth. Now that offers services to the entire community. It is one of the most important ways in which we fulfill that idea of being the relevant university, being connected to the problems of our community. Among other things, we do that by translating science into solutions, and for example, delivering high-quality health care. But in addition to actually running a large integrated academic health system, we care a lot about the health of our students, and there's as you know, a student health service here. One of the good things, and just for our visitors from other places, we're very proud of a major facility that's about to be open. And I'm sure it's been built with all kinds of resistance against hurricanes. But just a couple of blocks from here, you can see a very nice facility that will be open, and it will be open for students. But I think the idea of taking care of the health of our students in general in a comprehensive way, all the health problems, and then those that are particularly acute in campuses. One of the big issues here is, of course, all the effects of stress, the risk of the consumption of alcohol and drugs. And what I have found very inspirational here is the amount of peer support. And yesterday I was actually meeting with a group of students, an organization called Peer 21, which deals exactly with this, and it's all peer support. In addition to that, so I have found that students talking with students, organizing around their own health and well-being is one of the most powerful forces. We also have the Herbert Wellness Center, and then if, despite all our attempts and the counseling, there's still need for health care, we of course have the service. But I believe that students acting with each other and women students dealing particularly with the challenges of women's health is an incredibly powerful force. Yes.
Hi, Dr. Frenk, I'm Brian Slomovitz. I'm the Director of Gynecologic Oncology for the Sylvester Comprehensive Cancer Center. And I'm speaking later this afternoon, but I really love that question. What can we do for the students? What we're at the Cancer Center, we're committed. When I say we, this is an effort not only for myself. I'm a surgeon, I give chemotherapy. Erin Kovitz in our group, she is leading the effort for prevention and reaching out to the community. Obviously, Dr. Knoll, it's one of the things why I love coming to these conferences. It's really knocking down these barriers. The community that we serve is all the way down to South America, to the Caribbean. I'll talk about our Caribbean Fellowship in a couple minutes, and the region, but we also are doing a better job in serving the community. In gynecologic oncology, in last year, in a co-effort that was led by Erin and myself, we have a weekly dysplasia clinic for women who feel that they may be at risk for having cervical precancers. So just because we're a tertiary referral center that offers immunotherapy and the latest and greatest in therapy, we also want to make sure that we're addressing the needs for women who have an abnormal Pap test, who have HPV, men who have abnormal anal Pap tests and HPV. We understand the population that we're treating. For ovarian cancer, we have an early detection clinic in ovarian cancer that we're really emphasizing that. Again, it's not just, it is for our community, but our community includes the undergraduate campus. And that's why we're really excited with Lennar opening up. Lennar is not going to be staffed by peripheral doctors that we don't care about. Lennar is going to be staffed by the division directors. I'm going to Lennar. My top colleagues are going. It's going to be a true extension of the medical campus. It's not just going to be another satellite. So we're really excited about it. The breast group that we have with Dr. Perez here, they treat more breast cancers than most other places in the region. So we're really excited about that opportunity, and I really appreciate that question. So thank you.
Thank you. That's Ambassador.
Thank you so much for those really wonderful and inspiring remarks. I just wanted to tap into your experiences, having been one of the leaders in the fight against HIV and AIDS in Mexico and really in the world, and to say, how do you think we can mobilize the resources that we need globally in order to better address cancer as a whole, certainly women's cancers? Thank you.
Well, it's a great question and a great way to end the session because, I mean, there's no question that along the eradication of smallpox as the one disease we have successfully eradicated, although I think we're getting closer and closer to polio, and I'm pretty confident that guinea worm will be the next one. But along the eradication, there's no question that the way the AIDS pandemic was handled has to count as one of the greatest victories of global health. And it was a victory of global civil society, because that's what AIDS produced, a global civil society movement. It was a victory of science, the capacity to rapidly identify the causal agent and then develop therapeutic agents, antiretrovirals. And then it was an amazing victory of global solidarity through organizations like the Gates Foundation, the Clinton Foundation, and it has to be said, we would not have the prices we have that make the treatment for millions of Africans possible had it not been for the work of the Clinton Foundation. And the will of the global community to create institutions like the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria. I mean, it's just one of the most amazing examples. The enlightened policy of the United States through the President's Emergency Fund for AIDS Relief PEPFAR program. Without any question, the most successful bilateral development assistance program in the history of not just this country, but I would dare say of the world. This is an extraordinary history. It inspired, it changed culture, it taught us to be more tolerant, it exposed the unacceptable nature of homophobia, and it created a movement for tolerance and inclusion. And AIDS is the great cultural transformation of the latter part of the 20th century going into the 21st century. But it also offered the model for what we need to do with other chronic diseases. And I think we need to take that page from history and adopt it, not adapt it because things are different, but adopt it for cancers. And the secret sauce is that amazing combination of top science, mobilized civil society that finds discrimination and stigma unacceptable and mobilized to fight that, and global solidarity. Now, if we can reproduce that for cancer, we will actually, make symposiums like this probably unnecessary in the future. Unfortunately, I don't think that's going to take a short time, but I think the blueprint is very clear, and your question is fantastic, Sally, because it does show that we have things we can learn from, that we have stories of success, and that should energize us to apply it to new challenges like breast cancer and old challenges like cervical cancer, to finish the unfinished agenda and tackle the emerging problems. Thank you very much. I hope everyone has a safe return home despite Matthew. I promise you, most of the time, this is a beautiful weather, not threatening at all, a safe place. We hope you come back to Miami many times. And please know that the University of Miami is here to partner and be a resource for the entire hemisphere. Thank you very much.